Welcome to episode 132 of Educate and Rejuvenate, the podcast, creating and honoring boundaries with Barb Flowers. Do you get sucked into checking emails or responding to messages 24/7, or just feel like you can never honor yourself and what your needs are when it comes to other people? Today, I'm interviewing teacher burnout coach Barb Flowers and we're talking all about how to create boundaries and how to actually stick with them, which is one of the big keys to having boundaries. So let's get to it. Welcome to Educate and Rejuvenate, the podcast to help you revitalize your teaching, renew your spirit, and reignite your passion for life. I'm your host, Kelsey Sorensen, a former teacher, current homeschool mom, published author, and certified life coach. Whether you are a teacher in a traditional classroom, homeschool from your kitchen table, or anywhere in between, I am on a mission to help you not only survive as an educator, but thrive. Get ready to uplevel your skills with incredible insights from guest experts and discover the missing piece, rejuvenating yourself. Are you ready to both educate and rejuvenate? Let's go. I am so excited to have Barb on the show today. She is a fellow certified life coach for educators. She's the host of the Teacher Burnout podcast and also the Principal's Handbook podcast because she has been a teacher. She's also now an administrator and a certified life coach for educators and administrators. So super cool. And we are so lucky to have her as one of our speakers at Educate and Rejuvenate this year. She'll be teaching a session called Energize Your Teaching, Preventing Burnout and Staying Inspired. Like, who needs that? We all want to prevent burnout. We all want to stay ignited and excited about what we do as teachers. So I'm so looking forward to that session. She's going to offer valuable tips about preventing burnout and strategies to reignite your passion for teaching, which is really part of what I love to do. Like, even my subtitle for my book is to revitalize your teaching, rejuvenate your spirit, and reignite your passion for life. So I feel like what she has to share really aligns with our mission. So I'm so excited to have her with us at Educate and Rejuvenate, but also here on the podcast today with you. So when we decided to do this interview, I had Barb fill out a form, schedule her interview, and she had a list of topics there. The one that just screamed out to me was boundaries, because it's a topic that has come up a lot in our coaching inside the Educate and Rejuvenate Club, but I have not yet done a full podcast episode about it. I think it was mentioned during the self-love challenge back in February, but we haven't done a full episode on it yet. So it's like, yes, we need to do this. We need to talk about boundaries. So I'm really excited for today's conversation. I feel like you'll probably gain some great insights on how you can create and honor boundaries in your own life. Now, this episode is probably geared a bit more towards those who teach in a traditional setting. If you're a homeschool parent listening, guess what? Next episode is really geared towards you. We'll be talking all about the lies we tell ourselves as homeschool moms. So either today's episode or the next one will totally be for you. Granted, I feel like either way, you could definitely gain some insight from both episodes. Like today, we're going to talk about boundaries in the classroom setting, but also in life in general. So if you are feeling the need to create and honor some boundaries in your life, no matter what, today's episode is for you. Like I said, we're going to talk about it in everyday life, so you'll definitely get something out of it. Okay, take that last bit off. Okay, so a little bit about Barb before we just dive in. That she, like I said, she has experience in education as an elementary principal and teacher. She's married with 2 kids in elementary and 2 stepkids in high school and college. She has a PhD in K-12 leadership, and she's a certified life coach. So she knows what she's talking about. She loves supporting educators in improving their well-being and improving their professional skills. And so today we're going to be talking all about boundaries together. So let's get to that interview. Okay, welcome, Barb, to Educate and Rejuvenate the podcast. I'm so excited to have you today.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I'm excited to be here.
And I am so excited to have you on talking about today's topic of boundaries, because that's one that's actually come up a lot, but I haven't even done an episode fully about it yet. I mean, it's been mentioned, but we haven't done a full episode on boundaries, and we're over 100 episodes in. I'm like, how did this happen? Here we are. I'm so excited that we get to do it together. So first, Barb, can you tell us, how would you define boundaries?
Well, I look at boundaries as they're like your standards, right? That's how you choose to live and where you set. I always think of a fence when I think of a boundary, right? So where you put a fence up to when something's not okay or what your limits are. So when I think of boundaries, I think you can set boundaries around your time. What are your limits on your time? You can set boundaries with your coworkers as an educator. You can set boundaries with administration and just setting boundaries and putting limits that work for you and what your capacity is as an educator, because we all have different capacities that we function at. And so you have to know what those limits are and where you need to put those boundaries.
Absolutely. And one thing that I found is sometimes people think like a boundary, and I want to see what your thoughts are on this. Like they think a boundary is like, oh, I'm going to tell you, you can't do that. But that isn't exactly a boundary, right?
Right, right. And so you have to know what works for yourself, and your boundaries are only things you can control. Like, you can't focus on what people say to you because that's their boundaries and that's what they can control. You just have to control how you react and what limits you set on that.
Exactly. So, a basic one might be like, and this isn't even in the classroom, but maybe just in general, like, hey, if you yell at me, I will leave the room, or I will hang up the phone, or I will go somewhere else. You can't tell them, you can't yell at me, but this is what I'll do if you choose to do that.
Correct. I think about myself, I set a boundary. I'm currently an elementary principal, and so when I have an angry parent and I find I'm getting nowhere, I set a boundary that this conversation is over and we'll have to have it at a different time because I won't let somebody scream at me and be rude to me.
Yes.
So I think I can't control what they're saying or how they're thinking about me, but I can control to sit there and take that language toward me. So setting a boundary that way, I think, is
Yes.
huge.
So it's not like you're like, okay, I'm not going to have this conversation right now. We're going to have to do it another time. But it's not like, oh, I can control exactly your reaction or what you're thinking about me and what you're thinking about this discussion. So, yes, that's
Right.
a perfect way to think about it. How do you successfully honor a boundary? I feel like sometimes we are like, oh, I have this boundary. But then if we don't actually hold the boundary, for example, you're a teacher and you tell the parent, I'm not going to check email or respond to emails after 5 p.m., but then you still do it, right? What kind of message is that sending? How do we successfully honor a boundary?
Well, the number one thing is you have to be consistent. Whatever you say you're going to do, you have to be consistent with that. You have to look at it like when we're with kids, we know if we give any leeway, right? Kids know what the boundaries are and they're going to push that boundary with behaviors. And it's the same thing with anything else that you do. If you're not consistent, and let's say you tell parents, I don't answer dojo messages or messages from a messaging service after 5 o'clock and you do it one time, you've already put that boundary down. You've already said, I don't stick to my boundaries. So consistency is the number one thing you can do. And it's also important to be clear about what those boundaries are.
Yeah.
As a principal, I send out a letter for the teachers, but I could even share it saying what the boundaries are with communication. You have to be really clear with families that they know what that boundary is or whoever you're setting a boundary with, and even being clear with yourself, right? If you're not clear with yourself that's an area that you need to work on. I've had to work with teachers a lot on checking messages over the weekend because we'd have conversations that it would ruin their whole weekend. And so it took those conversations and the reflection to realize that a boundary needed to be set. So once that boundary was realized that it needed to be set, then we could focus on being clear with what the boundary is that needed to happen and being consistent with making sure that we showed up and we were constantly sticking to what we said with our boundaries.
Oh, those are both so important, like being clear about it. And then, yes, honoring it.
Mhm.
And I think there are things you could do to make it easier to do that too. For example, maybe you turn off like dojo notifications on the weekend so you're not tempted to be like, oh, I just got a message or whatever. You don't even see it. I find that can help if you're like, I need a little bit of help for myself honoring this boundary. If you created those bad habits, I find things like that can definitely help.
Yeah, and it's hard to go back. Once you've already broke a
Mhm.
boundary, it's hard to reestablish that boundary. So, and that is another great thing about teaching is that we get to start over every year.
Yeah.
So, if you know that there were boundaries that you didn't have last school year, summer is a great time to reflect on that. Think about what boundaries need to be set and put in place to help you be more successful and maybe less stressed, less overwhelmed, and put those in place and be really clear and consistent with them starting the year.
Yes, and that is such a great way to refresh, right? Because you're going to have new parents, you're going to have new students. A new year is like a new beginning, and that's a great time to be like, okay, I'm going to get more clear with these boundaries. This is what I'm going to do. So, for example, what are some boundaries that teachers might need to set? And I know you even talked about an email that you sent out on behalf to the parents or whatever. What are some examples of a clear boundary that they could set? You could either describe what was in that email or just some other ideas.
Yeah, so definitely some clear boundaries that we have to set as a school that I have to help teachers with are with communication. That one, communication times are crucial. But another thing that happens a lot with messaging and it being so easy to message the teachers is I see that parents will message the teachers instead of calling the office and notifying us. So teachers are then stuck dealing with things that are really office
Oh,
issues.
yeah.
Yeah, so helping parents and sometimes they just don't know, and so helping parents know who to communicate with in the school that's not the teacher. Like, if their child complains there's a recess issue, you don't necessarily need to notify the teacher, you can call the principal because
Mhm.
the teacher's not going to know, they're not outside at recess, or if there's an issue with the nurse, you don't need to call the teacher,
Yeah.
so communicate that to take that off of them, but I just think as a teacher, the more that we can communicate and be clear about what those boundaries are. I also think boundaries with I see all the time cell phones too,
Mhm.
and this is
Mhm.
where I think it can tricky, like parents wanting teachers' cell phone numbers.
Yeah.
So that's a boundary. If you have a boundary about parents like requesting you as a friend on social media, again, if that's a boundary you have, you want to be really clear that I don't take requests from parents and be consistent on that. So whatever those boundaries are, consistency is key there. But I think I would say communication for sure is the biggest boundary that we need to set. And I think it's because we're in such an instant world right now where it's like, oh, I could just message the teacher and hopefully she'll message me back right now. Or even I know that parents will message teachers thinking that their child's the only child in the class. Like, how is their day today?
Right.
And I have teachers who are like, well, I have 25 kids. I can't do that. So it's like, you've got to set that boundary. They had a great day. I'll let you know if anything goes wrong, but I generally do not message parents every single day about their child, things like that as well. I think we just have to be really clear because you have to look at it from their perspective too. Sometimes they don't realize everything teachers do and they don't know. So we just have to be clear about.
Yes, absolutely. I think just, yeah, being clear with those boundaries and communication is a big one because, yeah, we're used to instant gratification, right? With being able to just order something on Amazon and it arrives the next day. That's what we're really
Uh-huh.
trained for. And even social media, they've studied that, right? And when you're scrolling, it's all about that instant gratification, that dopamine hit. And so parents might be reaching out and they don't have bad intentions. It really is just about holding those boundaries and being clear and communicating. That's really the big thing. What about, I know because you kind of understand both the teacher side and the administrator side. What are some boundaries that teachers might need to have with administrators? What I've heard from some of the members in our Educate and Rejuvenate Club is like they really want to make their principals happy, right? They really want their administrator to like them. And they might say yes to things that maybe they don't feel the capacity for. And it's not even necessarily the administrator's fault or anything, but what are just some boundaries in general that might be appropriate, right? There are some things that might not be appropriate. So, what might be appropriate for boundaries between teachers and administrators, and what might not be?
I always tell my teachers because we have lots of committees in the school, and I have people who want to be on every committee, and then I have people who don't want to be on a committee. And I talk to teachers and I might ask them to do something, and some teachers are like, no, I can't do this. And some just say yes. And I just kind of going back to what I've said, you have to be really clear. I'm asking because I think that you would be a good fit on the committee, but I don't know what you're thinking and what's going on in your life as a teacher.
Mhm.
And so I think you just have to know that it's okay not to, like, people please,
Uh-huh.
and most administrators that I know would not hold it against anybody if they said, "No, I can't join that committee due to things that you have going on." Everybody's at a different stage in their life, and if that's pointed out, I think that that's a really good way to set a boundary. I always just say, "I'm not a mind reader, just please be clear with me if you can't do it." I never wanna put extra stress on you. I need you to be open and transparent, and I'll try to be the same with you. But I think just communicating and having those conversations, but it's boundaries with committees can be a hard thing. Uh, If if you're staying late or coming in early, having boundaries about that, I think that's okay to communicate that. I don't think there's anything wrong with communicating like, hey, I need to leave here at 4 o'clock every day because of whatever, or I just need to leave every day at four
Right.
o'clock. There's not a problem with that. And I think you just, if you have an issue with that, need to communicate that. I also think, I'm just thinking of some possible things that could be an issue, but like taking a sick
Oh,
day, you
yes, that's
know?
a big one, and one I've helped a lot of teachers
Yeah,
with.
right, and I know in all of my roles, I have felt guilty every time I take a sick day, and it's like, no, you have to have those boundaries. If you don't feel good, like, you're an adult, you get to decide that, and I say that because my friend and I would call, like, "I feel like this," and we're both teachers, you know, "Is that enough to take a sick
Right.
day?" So guilty about it, but it's like, we're adults, we know if we don't feel good, we know if we need to be home, we know if we have to be home with our kids, and we need to not feel guilty. We have the sick day, put it in, that's our boundary. It is what it is, we don't need to be questioned about it, and I know every contract's different with teachers and things like that, but I do think that's a boundary there too, is that you have yourself and your family to take care of, so I think that's a boundary you always need to communicate and be clear about.
Absolutely, and I can and I have done full episodes on sick days and everything. I don't know if you know, but our whole the way my brand even started and grew was we did our ready to go sub plans and our sub binders. So that's like a big thing we've helped teachers with. And there's a lot of mindset with that. There's a lot of, oh, I can't take a day off because there's a sub shortage. Even though I like earned these sick days or whatever, I just can't because that would inconvenience people. And I think again, that's really good to want to think about your team and maybe be like, okay, maybe this time I won't take a sick day, but this time I will because I do need to take care of myself. And then I know that if a teammate, they need to take a day off, I will help with their class if needed, even if the class has to split. I know that's been happening in some areas, but if that needs to happen for someone to be able to take care of themselves and take a day off, then you can help each other out with that.
Yeah, and I'm like, "Nobody wants you here if you're sick,
Exactly. It could
go
make the
home."
problem worse if it then suddenly goes around the whole school instead of only you. I'm sure you've had experience with that.
Right, and I'm like, "We will figure it out. Kids will not be left unmonitored."
Yes, like, it will be
So
sorted
it'll
out one
all
way
be
or the
fine.
other, and it won't be the end of the world. It might not be, "Oh, this is the ideal day," but there can be a normal day that's not the ideal day. So, we
Yeah,
know that in
right,
education. It's just some days are different than others depending on, like, the
right.
kids and where they're at and their nervous system regulation and everything going on.
Yeah, yeah. So I think just being clear about what you need and having that self-care. I talk to teachers about that a lot. Don't feel guilty for taking care of yourself, and I talk to principals about that. We all in education are guilty of taking care of others first,
Mhm.
and a boundary of self-care, who can argue with a boundary of self-care? I just feel like that's so crazy to even think about. We have to put ourselves first. We have to put our families first and make them a priority. I always tell my staff, like, we all love education, we love kids, but at the end of the day, we work because we want to provide for our
Mhm.
families. So that's number one, right? So,
Right, and one thing I actually did while I was writing my book too, on what you were saying about not wanting to put ourselves first, but I look because people think, "Oh, if I put myself first, that's selfish." But I actually looked up the dictionary definition of selfish, and it was saying that being selfish is chiefly concerned with only yourself at the expense of others. And that isn't putting yourself first, that's trying to step on people because you wanna be above them. But just like putting yourself first, I need to make sure my cup is full before I take care of these students or work with my grade level team or whatever. Like, I need to make sure that I'm taken care of. And that isn't being selfish. That's just making sure that you're being taken care of. The opposite of that selfish, like being chiefly concerned with only other people is or only yourself is only being concerned about other people and not caring about yourself. And I think that sometimes the direction teachers tend to go, they really are pouring it out on everyone else and not enough to themselves.
I always say boundaries is the number one thing to help prevent burnout because like you said, if you're pouring into everybody and never yourself, there you might feel like you're okay, but there will be a point where it'll just hit you and you'll be burnt out because we can't do that forever. Our bodies are not made for that. We need self-care, we need to regulate ourselves, we need to take care of our own mindset and just focus on being the best version of us so we can help others. So that I think is where those boundaries come in because I mean, this is just a personal boundary for me, but starting my day every day with exercise, that is a boundary I set with myself and my family. Like, I work out at home. I get up every morning. Sorry, if you need something, figure it out. This is my half hour to myself to
Yeah.
exercise. And it's something that is like a non-negotiable for me because that's my only time in my day that is truly focused on myself. So I think having something like that is really important.
Yes, I think it's so important. And I actually I am with you. I love to do my exercise in the morning and kind of having that time because I get up before the rest of my family's up. So it's really that time of stillness and to be with myself and to exercise and just fill my cup so then I can fill up everybody else's after I feel complete, you know?
Yeah.
Oh, I love this. So what just we're kind of wrapping up here, but what boundaries again, I like to talk about on this show, not just teaching, but our full lives, right? Because we're teachers. Teaching is one aspect of our lives, and then we've got everything else going on. What are some other ways that boundaries can help us in our life outside of teaching as well? I feel like it's a skill that when utilized in teaching, it helps us use it in our lives and vice versa.
Well, I know for me, I can be a one thing I've worked on a lot is being a people pleaser. And when I think of a people pleaser, it's really like a lack of boundaries, right? It's
Mhm.
about everybody else and I'm not setting boundaries. And so what I see that happens in my personal life when I don't set boundaries is I am like, yeah, I'll go to that event and that event and that event. And so I'm running me and my kids around to 3 different events that we're not
Yep.
really even enjoying any of them because I'm like, I can make it to everything. I can do it all. And in the process, I'm stressed out. I'm not enjoying myself. I'm yelling at my kids. So I just think another way in your personal life is really thinking about your time management and how you create those boundaries around it. My husband is so great at being like, we have one event planned. We're going to leave it at one.
Yeah.
There's one's planned. We don't need to plan anything else. And I'm like, well, we could do something else too. He's like, nope, one event. And it helps so much with your stress. And because when you're constantly feeling like you're running from one thing to the next and you're just trying to get everything in. I know for me, it just makes me feel like I'm doing nothing
Yeah.
well. I'm
Yep.
overwhelmed. I don't even know. I don't have a second to breathe and really think about the things that I have going on. So I think a thing that we need to make sure we're doing in our personal life is that time management piece because I'm guilty about even before work, I do 10 million things in the morning because I'm like, if I can do it before I go to work, it makes me feel better when I get home. But then I have to stop and think, is it worth being stressed in the morning
Yeah.
and stress my entire family? So I think really putting those boundaries into place on what can you actually get done in the morning? What can you get done in a certain amount of time? So that you don't feel overwhelmed and stressed out and can just be more relaxed and more present in your life.
Yes, I think boundaries around time are crucial. And this is one I honestly personally really relate to right now with working on my book and the event and the rebrand and homeschooling still, so many things that we're doing. And there was like a weekend where we just had so much going on. And then we got invited to another family dinner. And I was like, well, we could go. We don't have anything at that time. But I was like, but I can't. I literally, my mental, emotional, I can't. And you can always say no, even if you don't have a valid reason, like something else you're at. A valid reason is just you need that time to decompress.
Right.
And yes, so I love that you mentioned trying not to have too much in your schedule because I do think that's where overwhelm can come in. And we don't have that time to regulate ourselves and rejuvenate. So love that. Okay. And then one last question about boundaries. I know that a lot of people are like, okay, this all sounds great. I want to do it, but I'm worried this is going to ruin my relationships if I try to hold a boundary. So what do you have to say about that?
I think when you set a boundary, you just have to do it in a way that's kind. If you're like, you're breaking my boundaries, I can't do that. And you talk to people like that, of course, they're going to be like, okay, and get upset. But if you communicate and have a conversation with people about what those boundaries are, nobody's gonna get upset with you. I think it's in our own mind that that's gonna happen.
Mhm.
It's like I said, it's that people-pleasing mentality. I always think when I set a boundary or when I say I can't go to something, like you said, if I don't have something else going on, that I have to have an excuse, and it's like, "No, you don't." And so I think just being more confident in yourself and your ability to know that it's okay to have that boundary for yourself and saying it in a confident, clear way. Brené Brown says clear is kind.
Yes.
I think if you don't say it in a clear way, then what I know I do
Me too.
is I would do the event anyways, and I would be mad the whole time
And is
doing
that
it.
helping your
And
relationship? Really think about it. You're like, I
right,
don't
and
want to do this because I don't want to ruin my relationship. But is you feeling resentful like helping your relationship?
right. And so I think if you can think of it from that lens, because I was volunteering at church for a while
Uh-huh.
and I enjoyed it, but at the same time, I was kind of resentful. And I'm like, I need to back away a little bit because I'm doing this from a place of like resent and not from a place of I want to do this. And nobody wants to be around you when you're in that space. And so I think being clear about what those boundaries are and just knowing that it's okay. You don't have to have an excuse. Be confident in who you are and what decisions you make, and people respect that. There's nobody that I've ever had a conversation with that sets boundaries that I'm like, "Oh, man, they're so rude."
Yeah.
I look at that and we respect it. I'm like, "Wow, that's really great." I have a friend who's an educator, and she's great about she puts her phone away and doesn't respond to group chats out from work and things like that, and people know that's her boundary,
Mhm.
and they just know that about her. She's not gonna respond to group chats after work, and it's not a big deal. So I think just being clear about who you are, what those boundaries are, and communicating them is going to help people just understand where you're coming from.
Yes, and I think what you said about the fear of what might happen is so much worse than usually what actually happens when you do that. So, just try it with a small boundary. You can always work your way up. Try a boundary, you see it feels good, and then just keep creating and honoring those boundaries as needed in your life.
I love how you said that because I started that with email. I actually took email off my phone, but it started with, okay, I'm not answering this email tonight. And then it started with me doing that more and more. And then I'm like, I'm taking it off my phone so I can't even check it. So I think that's a great way to get started is just take those micro steps.
I love it. Well, this has been so good. A great first episode about boundaries. I'm so excited we finally did it and that you helped make it happen. So, thank you so much, Barb. And you're also part of our Educate and Rejuvenate event coming this summer. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you're going to be teaching there?
Yeah, I'm really excited because I will be talking about re energizing your teaching. So I'm going to just talk about how you bring that passion back to teaching. If you're feeling burnt out and overwhelmed, how do you get that passion back? Because I always think about that feeling you have as a student teacher when you're new to teaching and everything's so exciting. And then we get into the career and time goes on and it gets stressful and we get these feelings that we're just burnt out and overwhelmed. And so I'm going to give you some strategies and tips on just how to re-energize your teaching to love it again.
I love that so much. I cannot wait for this session to go out there so all the teachers at our event can hear it and watch it. And oh, it's just going to be so good. And just it fits in perfectly with the event as a whole, where we're really trying to help teachers learn how to up level themselves in their career with teaching and also personally. It's really personal development meets professional development. So, so excited for the event and
Yeah.
that you're participating in it. But the event isn't happening for another, like, probably about 6 weeks from when this episode goes live. So, can you share also, and again, they might want to just connect with you outside of it. What else do you have for our listeners in the meantime, and where can they connect with you?
Yeah, so I have a podcast, the Teacher Burnout Podcast. You can find me on that podcast. You can also find me on Instagram at Barb Flowers Coaching and find me there. And I'd love the opportunity to connect with you and share what I've been doing with teacher burnout.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Barb. This was such a great interview. I loved chatting with you, and I love that everybody else is going to get so much insight about how they can create and honor boundaries in their teaching, in their lives.
Well, thank you for having me on, Kelsey.
If you enjoyed this episode, please hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if you're hungry for more, be sure to check out the book that I wrote. It's called Educate and Rejuvenate, a 3-step guide to revitalize your teaching, renew your spirit, and reignite your passion for life. It is scheduled to be released in the summer of 2024. This book takes all the life coaching skills we talk about here on the podcast and puts them together in one easy to understand guide. Plus, when you pre-order, you'll receive a PDF workbook and additional resources to deepen your understanding and application of the concepts we've covered on the book and on this podcast. You won't find these resources anywhere else. Visit the link in the show notes to join the waitlist and be the first to know when the book becomes available for pre-order. Let's continue this journey of growth and rejuvenation together. Until next time.